just talking specifically about Canada, we are experiencing what appears to be a rapid acceleration due to a mass influx of people from other parts of the world. I think from Muslim countries, they're the second largest influx of people to the Canadian society. And let's face it, people in Canada were really struggling with this in a lot of ways. So, are you surprised by this? That is that we're having such a mass influx of people to our country, and are you surprised that we're struggling to deal with it in the ways that we are right now?
Well, I mean, the question that I have in mind is how these issues are constructed. So these problems did not begin yesterday, if, if you're going to define them as a problem, or the situation did not arrive as if, unannounced and to take us by surprise. These are all decisions of these governments, and that is forgotten. Because there's only one type of immigrant. If you're going to talk about immigrant, Leighton, let's be serious about it. You are a lawyer.
Right.
There's only one type of immigrant, an immigrant who travels, if you're talking about North America, two vast oceans on either side of the continent, who come from whichever point in the world, arrives in North America with documents provided to that individual or to the family by the government. So where does the point of an immigrant fades away and becomes a citizen?
Right.
Right? I mean, is an immigrant forever an immigrant? In that case, this whole continent is immigrant. So we have to be serious about how this is constructed instead of it becoming weaponized by politicians for their own ends. And I see that is exactly what is happening in North America and in Europe. Now, to the government, I was about 12 years ago, I think it was, invited to be an expert witness at the Committee for Immigration and Multiculturalism. And I pointed out, both the statistically and historically and contextually, that ultimately the responsibility is upon the parliament and the government on how the immigrant population will be absorbed into the rest of Canada. That's a choice that the Canadians have to make. It is not a choice of people from outside of Canada who's either seeking to come to Canada through the process of what is Canada's policy about immigration, or by factors that are out of their control, whether it is natural disasters or wars that becomes the push factor, whether it is in Africa, whether it is in Latin America, whether it is in South Asia, Middle East, etc. And then governments in the Western countries have adopted policies to deal with those calamities.
Right. So one of these concepts is multiculturalism. And I was watching an interview recently of Douglas Murray, who's a British scholar. You probably know about him. He's written an interesting book called The Strange Death of Europe. But he was being interviewed by Piers Morgan. And he was saying that, generations of British people have gone to places like China and India and lived there for a very long time. But they never become Indian. They never become Chinese because those cultures don't adopt this idea of multiculturalism. This multiculturalism seems to be distinctive to the West, and it doesn't seem to be serving the West very well. I know you have a deep understanding of this multiculturalism, the way that's being defined by governments, as you say. Could you explain, kind of break down that concept, what it means, and why it's important?
Well, I mean, the very term multiculturalism was a construct in Canada. We are the country that innovated this policy, going back to the early 1970s, the period after the centenary year, 1967, when Pierre Trudeau became the prime minister in the election in 1968. And it was a construct which appealed to the politician because we could now say to the rest of the people, your culture, wherever you're coming from, you're welcome to Canada. And that became a talking point. That became a narrative. We are an open, generous, compassionate society. And the liberals went around, promoting all the various cultures in Eastern Canada, in Central Canada, in Western Canada, and we went along, we held that policy to the rest of the world. We have forgotten that.
Mm-hmm.
So this context of multiculturalism, that we are a country made up of immigrants, and they come to Canada, or we have invited them to come to Canada, we host them, we celebrate with them their cultures that they have brought to Canada, because, and here is the critical point, because all cultures are equal.
Right. Right.
Well, this was an abstract notion, all cultures are equal. I wrote a book about this. By what standard? By what measure? By what metric all cultures are equal? Yeah, it was a very nice thing to say all cultures are equal, and very generous thing to say, and compassionate thing to say. But in political terms, in terms of policy, how are you going to navigate through, as a country, a sovereign country, with a national interest, when all cultures are equal?
Right.
So this is the problem or situation that has been constructed by the people in power over here.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you say that all cultures are equal, how are you going to navigate through that culture? Do we bring the baggages from 360 points of the world into Canada, and then say, because we are in Canada, we're interested in whatever is the point from where we departed.
Right.
So we are, Canada has to be involved in the Ukraine war. Canada has to be involved in the Palestinian war. Canada has to be involved in the catastrophe taking place and somewhere in Latin America, etc., etc. We have given up our decision-making processes to this complete tapestry or potpourri of cultures who do not have the willingness, or we are ourselves insincere and hypocritical, hypocrisy,
Mm-hmm.
and so on and so forth. These are very pertinent questions.
Mm-hmm.
But in the process of this last 50 plus years, half a century, we have completely made a dog's breakfast out of a country which was at one time held up as a model for the rest of the world.
Yes.
Here we are. What is our history? What is our policy? What is our national interest?
Mm-hmm.
I am as confused as anyone who thinks about this thing is confused.
Yes. So one of the presumptions underlying multiculturalism, as you point out, is that all cultures are equal. The other mantra of governments is that diversity is strength. But we're finding out in places like Great Britain and Canada and the US, as you say, that this is not really true. That in fact, diversity causes conflict. It causes clashes of culture. That it actually causes instability of cultures and reduces trust in societies that were once very, very trust based. Is this by design of governments who are pushing multiculturalism? And if so, what do you think is the real agenda behind that?
Good question. And again, the landscape, the discussion by necessity is also a large issue.
Right.
Yes, I would say, that once you start connecting the dot, it is by design.
Right.
Nothing happens by coincidence. So there is a design behind it. Look, the issue about multiculturalism, all cultures equal, you bring your baggage of culture. People bring their own cultural baggage, So I, as a person born in India, have my love for Indian spices and Indian food. But my children grew up going to McDonald's. So they adapt. This is also a natural part of our human existence.
Sure.
We adapt. So the notion all cultures are equal was a constructed notion by the Canadian government, adopted in Europe, adopted in America, and so on, out of which comes out the notion of DEI, diversity, and so
Right.
on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have to go back to the starting point, the original point. Why was this done?
Mm.
Who asked you to do it? I mean, if there are societies that are truly multicultural, then I'm only referring to my own history or the history of the people that I left behind. India is possibly one of the most multicultural countries in the world.
Right. Yes.
But India is not a multicultural country. India has its own policy of emphasizing that you are an Indian. You're not a hyphenated Indian. You might have your own language group. You might have your own, cuisine. You might have your own music and so on and so forth. But as an Indian, we come together. And nobody's saying that you should give up your own, particular culture,
Right.
And as a nation state with a national policy, you come together,
Right.
So we should have insisted upon that it is not simply language. Wherever people have come from, here in Canada, we have a certain way of doing things.
Right.
We have a certain way of understanding how we cohabit together because we have our history, a Canadian history.
Mm-hmm.
And we emphasize that, and we should and must emphasize that right through grade 1 and kindergarten all the way to postgraduate studies. That's how we build a nation state instead of fragmenting.
Yeah.
This whole idea of multiculturalism is a fragmentation of the unity, of bringing people together. We are naturally in a world. It was a Canadian, Marshall McLuhan, talked about the global village.
Right.
So we are living in a global village. We are naturally in a world that is diverse. But do we then make the notion of diversity in a way, use it to fragment whatever is within Canada?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the argument should be a no. But what is happening in the West? What is happening in the West is a term that was coined at about this time, and that term was postmodernism.
Right.
Postmodernity then means a deconstruction of what is modern, and in that sense, it also means dismantling of modernity. So when you dismantle modernity, you're dismantling the very concept of a nation state, you're dismantling the very concept of your core identity as a nation state. So here we have our prime minister, the son of the former prime minister who brought in multiculturalism. His son, in the very first interview that he gave after being elected as the head of the government in 2015 to New York Times, talked about celebrating that Canada is the first postmodern country with no core identity.
Right.
None of us are making this up.
Yes.